The first thing I want to point out is that I'm presenting this on behalf of a team of people who worked on the development of the policy and who some of whom are here. Not everybody, time zone doesn't permit us all to be here, but a lot of people worked on the revision project that got us to this 2020 version of the policy, and there's also a team of people who have been working and continue to work on implementing the policy. So my colleagues here today are Carla Suarez-Weiser, the editor-in-chief of the Cochrane Library, who many of you will know, Fergus Macbeth, who until recently was a conflict of interest arbiter, Graham Smith, who's a project manager from the editorial and methods department, who worked on the policy, developing the policy and is on the implementation team, Maria Girardi, who also works for EMD and is on the policy implementation team, and I'll just check. And Andreas Lund, who's also a conflict of interest arbiter currently, and you've met. I think that's everybody from the team who've worked on the policy. So I'm gonna run through the rationale for revising the policy. We're going to look at a few policy highlights, key things that have changed, and we'll talk about implementing the policy and some and training and support. So can we have the next slide, please, Ollie? Thanks. So the first thing I'll say is that I'm going to deliberately try not to describe these policies as old and new. Just to avoid any kind of indication that we haven't had a COI policy before, that this new policy has just come into existence. Currently, review production and indeed conflict of interest generally in Cochrane is governed by the 2014 commercial sponsorship policy. And that's the policy that has been revised, and now we have a new version, which is the Cochrane's conflict of interest policy for Cochrane library content. But Cochrane has had a conflict of interest policy for many years, dating back essentially to 2004. So we're sort of, we're over 15 years into having, quite a robust policy. Next slide, please, Ollie. But policies do change. The world changes, so do policies. We undertook this revision at the request of Cochrane's governing board, but in any case, revision was built into the 2014 policy. So that is something that we always intended to do here at Cochrane. In fact, it was probably a little bit overdue to be revised, but that was always the plan. And a conflict of interest policy is a really key platform in us maintaining our reputation for independence and credibility. So having a policy that that's current and strong is very important. And we also feel strongly that if you create content according to a rigorous conflict of interest policy, that strengthens reader confidence particularly in Cochrane reviews. Next slide, Ollie. Okay. So there are some things that haven't changed from 2014 to 2020. For a very long time now, we have not permitted Cochrane reviews to be funded by commercial organisations that have a financial interest in the topic of the review, and that hasn't changed. We also don't permit people who are employed by commercial organisations with a financial interest in the review topic to be authors on Cochrane reviews. We require that a first author must be free of all conflicts, of all financial conflicts. Now that means, so that's not just about employment, that's about having any other kind of financial conflict of interest, which could be consultancies or travel expenses or speakers fees or anything that could be, anything that we define as a financial conflict of interest. And the other thing that hasn't changed is that we don't apply a threshold for financial conflicts. So it doesn't matter whether a person has received £500 or $500 or 5,000. The policy applies equally, regardless of the financial of the amount received. Next slide, Ollie. But there have been a number of quite important changes. So as I mentioned earlier, the policy, the 2014 commercial sponsorship policy was intended to kind of cover all Cochrane groups, activities, but in fact the wording really meant that it kind of was really slanted quite heavily towards review production. So the policy revision, the conflict of interest policy revision project board made a very conscious decision to focus this revision on Cochrane Library content. Now, we know obviously there are fields and there are geographic groups. We have a governing board. There are other situations or activities within Cochrane to which a conflict of interest policy needs to be applied. So there will be a companion policy developed to deal with all those other aspects of conflict of interest within Cochrane. In the meanwhile, until that's developed, the current 2014 policy is still in place. But this new policy is really about Cochrane Library content. So that means Cochrane reviews and protocols, editorials, and Cochrane clinical answers, essentially. Another important change is that some of you will be aware in the 2014 policy, we have a requirement that more than 50% of an author team must be free of all financial conflicts of interest. That has increased to 2/3. So now 2/3 of the author team must be free of all financial conflicts, and 1/3 may have some of those financial conflicts but not be employed. As I said, it's for many years now been the case that the first author must be free of all financial conflicts of interest, but now we've extended that to include the last author as well. And we've also put in place some restrictions on what role people who've been involved in eligible studies can play in a Cochrane review. So in particular, what we're interested in is really people who have been who've been closely involved with industry controlled clinical studies. And if a study was industry controlled and is eligible for inclusion in the review, people who are people who are involved in those studies can't be the lead, can't be the first or the last author. They can still be in the author lineup, but not in those two positions. And we've also got some restrictions over how people who have worked on clinical studies that are included in the review can manage those data within the review. But that's actually always been the case. We've expanded that slightly. But it's always been the case that you can't extract your own data if you've worked on a trial. You can't determine, you can't assess risk of bias, etc. Next slide, Ollie. So another important addition is the introduction of a management strategy for cases where not-for-profit organisations employ Cochrane authors or fund reviews, and that where those organisations could be considered to have a specific financial interest. A specific interest in the outcome of the review. Now, that's not a financial interest because they're not-for-profit organisations, and it's not intended as by any means to be a blanket ban, because we know that many reviews are funded through public institutions, not-for-profit organisations. But this clause has been added to the policy in cases where the review group might be concerned that a not-for-profit organisation has an interest in the outcome of the review, and they can refer that case to the conflict of interest arbiters. We've also, in line with other journals and with a change that was made by the ICMJE, the International Committee of Medical Journal Editors. We've also specified that willful failure to disclose relevant conflicts of interest will be considered to be a form of scientific misconduct. And as I said, that's in line with kind of other journals in the biomedical publishing sector. We've also made it very clear now that Cochrane review groups and editorial and methods department staff must be free from all relevant financial conflicts of interest. And next slide, Ollie. Okay, so there are some things where we haven't really made a change. We've just made things clearer. It's a very common scenario that authors of Cochrane Library content, particularly reviews, will receive payments, and those payments go to the individual's home institution rather to them personally. And that was kind of covered, but not particularly clearly but not particularly clearly in the 2014 policy. So we've made that clear now. And if the situation is that an individual doesn't get the payment personally, it goes to that person's home institution, and that person doesn't have any control over those funds. They perhaps go into a departmental fund that they don't control and they can't access, then we don't consider those to be relevant conflicts. We've made it clearer what the requirements are for declarations of interest when reviews are updated and when new authors are added. Again, they are expectations currently as part of the policy, but we've just made that clearer. We've also made timeframes clearer. There's no change. The timeframe, the relevant timeframe in the policy is 36 months. That hasn't changed, but we've just made it clearer now that the conflicts that people report are relevant in the period 36 months prior to the title being registered, and that goes through until publication. So it covers any other conflicts that might be acquired or financial kind of compensation that a person receives throughout the review production process, right through to publication. We've also made it clear that a peer reviewer with a direct financial interest associated with a review can't be involved in that review. And we've spelled out more clearly the responsibilities of authors, of Cochrane review groups, and of the editorial methods department in relation to implementing the policy.